There is something underneath the Rocky Mountains that doesn't belong in any history textbook you've ever read. Something that doesn't fit the official story of who first walked this continent, when they arrived, or what they built before the world remembered their names. Geologists have found it. Explorers have crawled through it. Indigenous elders have spoken about it in languages that predate every written record we possess. And yet the academic world has spent the better part of a century looking at the evidence and quietly deciding not to talk about it too loudly. Tonight, that changes. Because the cave system beneath these ancient peaks is one of the most extraordinary unsolved mysteries in the entire history of North America. And once you understand what's down there, you will never look at this continent the same way again. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now, let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning that gets taught in schools, not the textbook version where humans arrive on this continent roughly 13,000 years ago by crossing a land bridge from Siberia, spread south, and build their lives from nothing. That story has been the official position for so long that it has calcified into something almost religious. You don't question it in polite academic company. You don't raise your hand and ask uncomfortable questions about the artifacts that don't fit, the structures that predate the accepted timeline, the cave systems that stretch for miles beneath mountain ranges in ways that no natural geological process has ever fully explained. But questions have a way of surviving, even when institutions try to bury them. And the questions that cluster around the cave networks beneath the Rocky Mountains are among the oldest, strangest, and most stubbornly persistent mysteries in the entire field of American archaeology. Here is what we know for certain, and what we know is already strange enough. The Rocky Mountains stretch for more than 3,000 miles through the western United States and Canada. They are among the oldest mountain ranges on this continent, formed over hundreds of millions of years of tectonic activity, glaciation, volcanic upheaval, and the kind of geological violence that reshapes continents. Beneath them, carved by water and time and the patient grinding of ancient geology, there are caves, thousands of them. Some have been mapped, most have not. The ones that have been mapped are remarkable enough on their own terms. But it is the ones at the edges of the maps, the ones where the surveys end not because the cave ends, but because something else stops the researchers from going further, that hold the real mystery. In the summer of 1909, a man named G.E. Kincaid was exploring the Colorado River Canyon system in Arizona when he discovered something that would either be one of the greatest archaeological finds in American history or one of the most elaborate hoaxes ever perpetuated on the press. Reading public. Depending on who you ask, it might be both. Kincaid, a government-sponsored explorer and hunter, claimed to have found a vast cave system carved into the canyon walls above the river. Not a natural cave, not a simple shelter used by passing nomads. Something else entirely. He described enormous chambers extending hundreds of feet underground. He described passageways cut at precise angles into solid rock, passageways so regular and consistent that they could not have been formed by water or by the random work of geological time. He described artifacts, statues, urns, copper instruments, tablets covered in hieroglyphic-style markings that resembled nothing in the accepted inventory of North American indigenous art. The Arizona Gazette ran a front-page story about the discovery in April of 1909. The Smithsonian Institution was named as the organization overseeing the excavation. And then, within months, the story disappeared. The Smithsonian denied any knowledge of the expedition. The site was never publicly located. Kincaid himself left almost no trace in the historical record. The cave, if it existed, was never opened to independent researchers. Now, you could dismiss this as a sensationalized newspaper story from an era when journalism operated under very different standards. And many historians have done exactly that, filed it under hoax or legend and moved on. But dismissal doesn't answer the question. It only closes the door on it. And there are too many other doors in this particular mountain range for the closing of one to settle anything at all. Because the Kincaid discovery, real or fabricated, was not an isolated claim. It was one node in a web of reports, excavations, indigenous oral histories, and geological surveys that, when you lay them all out together, begin to suggest something that the official narrative of North American prehistory has never adequately addressed. There are people who lived in these mountains long before any civilization we acknowledge, and they went underground. Let's talk about what the geology actually tells us, because this is where the story gets complicated in ways that professional scientists genuinely struggle with. The Rocky Mountain cave systems that have been formally surveyed include some of the most extensive underground networks on the continent. Wind Cave in South Dakota, located at the eastern edge of the Black Hills, is one of the longest caves in the world. As of the most recent surveys, it contains more than 150 miles of mapped passages, and geologists believe the actual extent of the system is far greater than what has been explored. Wind Cave is notable for a geological formation called boxwork, a honeycomb lattice of thin calcite fins that covers the cave walls and ceilings in patterns so intricate and extensive that Wind Cave contains more than 95% of all boxwork found anywhere on Earth. This is not unusual. This is extraordinary. The formation of boxwork requires very specific geological conditions that persisted for enormously long periods of time. Wind Cave is ancient in a way that makes the concept of ancient feel inadequate. Jewel Cave, also in South Dakota, is even longer, more than 220 miles of mapped passage, making it the third longest known cave in the world. And again, geologists are confident that the mapped portion represents only a fraction of the actual system. But these are the famous caves, the ones with visitor centers and guided tours and geological plaques. They are remarkable. They are not the mystery. The mystery lives in the smaller systems, the ones that don't have names, the ones where the survey team stopped because the passage became too narrow, or the air quality changed, or the equipment failed in ways that seemed inexplicable, or the indigenous landowners asked them to leave. The mystery lives in the caves that show evidence of human habitation so old that the standard dating methods produce numbers that cannot be reconciled with the accepted timeline of American prehistory. In 1971, a team of geologists and archaeologists conducting a routine survey of a cave system in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado found something that they spent several years arguing about before quietly publishing a paper that received almost no attention. Deep in the cave system, in a chamber that required several hours of crawling through passages too narrow for comfortable movement, they found the remnants of what appeared to be a constructed wall. Not a natural geological feature, a wall, built from precisely fitted stones without mortar, in a style that resembled nothing in the documented archaeological record of the region. The stones had been carried into the cave from outside. The nearest matching stone type was found on a surface formation more than a mile away. Someone had moved those stones underground and arranged them with deliberate care. The dating of organic material found near the wall produced an age of approximately 14,000 years. This was not a number the team could comfortably publish. It predated the accepted arrival of humans in North America by more than 1,000 years, and it placed construction activity in a cave system at a time when the official record says there should have been no one in the region to do any constructing at all. The paper was published in a small geological journal with careful hedging language. The possibility of contamination was noted. The dating was described as preliminary. The wall itself was described as a geological curiosity, and the broader implications, the question of who built it and why, were left entirely unaddressed. This is not unusual behavior for researchers working at the edges of accepted timelines. The professional cost of making a strong claim that contradicts established consensus is severe. Careers end. Funding disappears. Reputations collapse. The safer path is always to describe the anomaly in the most conservative possible language. Flag it as requiring further study and move on before anyone asks the question you cannot answer without destroying everything you've built. So the wall in the San Juan Mountains remained a footnote, and the cave system that contained it received no further formal attention. But the indigenous communities of that region had always known the cave was there, and they had always known it was not empty. The Ute people have lived in the Colorado mountains for at least 2,000 years by the most conservative archaeological estimates, and probably far longer. Their oral traditions describe the mountains as inhabited by presences that predate their own arrival, by the remnants of older peoples who went underground when the world above became inhospitable. These older peoples are described in Ute tradition not as enemies or rivals, but as something more like predecessors, builders of things that the Ute themselves did not build, keepers of knowledge that was encoded into the landscape itself. The Hopi people of Arizona, whose traditions are among the most thoroughly documented of any indigenous North American group, describe their emergence from underground in language so specific that it has fascinated anthropologists for more than a century. The Hopi cosmology describes a succession of worlds, each one destroyed and replaced by a new one, with the survivors of each destruction moving through an opening in the earth called the Sipapu to reach the next world. The Sipapu is a physical concept in Hopi architecture and ritual. It is a small hole in the floor of the kiva, the ceremonial underground chamber that represents the point of emergence from the underworld. Now, this could be purely symbolic. Creation mythology across every human culture involves some version of emergence, birth, the movement from darkness to light, from below to above. The underground as a source of life is one of the oldest and most universal metaphors in human spiritual thought. But the Hopi don't describe the Sipapu purely as a metaphor. They describe it as a real location, a physical place in the landscape. And the location they have traditionally pointed to is in the Grand Canyon, near the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado rivers, in a region that sits directly above one of the most extensive unmapped cave systems in the American Southwest. There are researchers, serious researchers with institutional affiliations and peer-reviewed publication records, who believe that the Hopi emergence narrative preserves a genuine cultural memory of a time when their ancestors, or the ancestors of their ancestors, actually lived underground. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally, in caves. In an extensive cave network beneath the Colorado Plateau and the southern Rocky Mountains, during a period of severe surface environmental stress that made the caves not a symbol of origin, but an actual refuge. The period in question is the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 14,000 years ago. This was one of the most catastrophic periods in the recent geological history of North America. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of the continent, was retreating. The melting was not gradual. It was punctuated by rapid collapse events, the most dramatic of which produced floods of a scale that modern geology has only recently begun to appreciate. The largest of these events, associated with the catastrophic draining of glacial Lake Agassiz, would have sent walls of water across vast regions of the continent. The environmental disruption would have been total for any surface-dwelling community in the affected areas. If there were people on this continent before 13,000 years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet collapse would have been an extinction-level event for surface communities. The question archaeologists cannot answer with confidence is whether any of those people survived, and if they did, how. Underground is one answer. The Rocky Mountain cave systems, particularly those in regions not directly in the path of the glacial flood events, would have offered stable temperatures, reliable water sources from underground aquifers, and protection from the surface catastrophe happening above. The cave temperature in most of the Rocky Mountain systems stays between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of surface conditions. During a period of rapid climate change and surface flooding, that stability would have been worth more than almost any other resource. A community that retreated underground during the worst of the Ice Age collapse could have survived there for generations, long enough for the surface to stabilize, long enough to develop or preserve a sophisticated body of knowledge about underground navigation and survival, long enough for the caves themselves to become home in a way that left marks on the culture, marks that might survive in the form of oral tradition, architectural practice, and sacred geography thousands of years after the community returned to the surface. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It is a serious possibility that a growing number of researchers in paleoanthropology and American archaeology have begun to explore, carefully, with the kind of hedged language that the profession requires when you're working near the edge of acceptable conclusions. But let's go deeper. Because the question of human habitation during the Ice Age is only one layer of this mystery. The layer beneath it is older, stranger, and considerably harder to explain. In 2016, a team of cave researchers working in the Lechuguilla cave system in New Mexico made a discovery that generated a brief period of scientific excitement before being absorbed into the enormous archive of things we know about and haven't fully explained. Lechuguilla is already one of the most extraordinary caves in the world. It stretches more than 145 miles and reaches depths of over 1,600 feet, making it the deepest limestone cave in the United States. Its formations are so unusual, so otherworldly in their scale and variety, that the cave served as a training ground for NASA astronauts preparing for the experience of operating in extreme, unmapped environments. What the 2016 team found was not a geological formation. It was a series of markings on the cave wall in a passage that had not been entered, as far as anyone could determine, since the cave's modern discovery in 1986. The markings were geometric, precise, and arranged in a pattern that the researchers could not identify as natural. They were not petroglyphs in the conventional sense. They were incised lines, cut into the limestone with a tool, running in parallel sequences that suggested deliberate measurement or recording rather than decorative intent. No indigenous tradition in the region claims connection to Lechuguilla. No archaeological site on the surface above the cave has produced artifacts consistent with a population that might have entered and navigated a cave system of that complexity. The nearest surface sites that show any cultural continuity date to roughly 3,000 years ago, thousands of years after the markings in the cave were estimated, through indirect geological methods, to have been made. The estimate was not published as a firm date. The researchers described the markings as of uncertain antiquity and noted that the geological context suggested they had been present for a very long time. The passage containing the markings was closed to further access pending additional study. As of the most recent information available, that study had not been published. This is a pattern, not a conspiracy, a pattern. The discovery of something anomalous in a cave system. The careful, hedged description of that anomaly, the restriction of access, the promise of further study, the silence that follows. It is not a conspiracy because the people involved are not coordinating to suppress a truth they all know. It is a pattern because the professional structure of academic research makes it very difficult to say clearly and loudly, "We found something that doesn't fit, and we don't know what it means." The easier path is always the one that doesn't require you to explain why everything you've built your career on might need to be revised. But the evidence keeps accumulating, and the people who sit with it long enough eventually have to reckon with what it suggests. Let's talk about the Anasazi. This is a word that carries enormous weight in the archaeology of the American Southwest and enormous controversy. The Anasazi, whose name in Navajo means something like ancient enemy or ancient people who are not us, built one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilizations in North America. Their cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, their great houses at Chaco Canyon, their astronomical alignments and road networks and ceramic traditions represent a culture of genuine complexity and ambition. They flourished for centuries and then, around 1300 CE, they abandoned their great sites. They walked away from Chaco Canyon, from Mesa Verde, from dozens of other settlements that had taken generations to build, and they left. Where they went is one of the great questions of American archaeology. The standard answer is that they dispersed, became the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. This is probably partly true, but the standard answer doesn't account for everything. It doesn't account for the settlements that simply stopped mid-construction. It doesn't account for the artifacts left behind in ways that suggest not deliberate abandonment, but rapid departure. And it doesn't account for the traditions among certain Pueblo communities of ancestors who went underground and have not yet returned. The Hopi word for the Anasazi is Hisatsinom, the people of long ago. The Hopi acknowledge them as ancestors. And in Hopi tradition, some of the Hisatsinom did not disperse to the surface settlements of the historical period. Some of them continued downward, into the earth, following the path of the emergence in reverse. They returned to the underground. This is treated in academic literature as mythology. But mythology is the form that cultural memory takes when the events being remembered are too old or too strange for straightforward narration. The question is always whether the mythological content preserves the outline of something real. There are caves in the Four Corners region, the intersection of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, that show evidence of ancestral Puebloan occupation. Structures built underground, not in cliff faces, but in genuine cave systems, in passages that required deliberate descent and navigation. Some of these sites have been documented by the National Park Service and are listed in the official archaeological record. But the depth of some of these structures, and the complexity of the passages leading to them, raises questions that the documentation doesn't address. Why would a sophisticated surface civilization choose to build in locations so difficult to access? The standard answer is defense. The cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde were clearly designed with security in mind. High walls, narrow entrances, positions that gave defenders a commanding view of approaching threats. The underground structures could reflect the same logic, taken to an extreme. But some of the underground ancestral Puebloan sites are not defensible. They are deep in cave systems where no natural light reaches, in chambers that could not have supported agriculture or the kind of daily life that requires sunlight. These are not places where people lived for practical reasons. They are places where people went for another purpose entirely, and the artifacts recovered from some of these chambers, when they have been excavated at all, suggest ritual, ceremony, the kind of deliberate, organized behavior that marks a space as sacred rather than functional. What were they doing underground? What did the underground mean to them that required them to go so deep into the rock? The answer, when you follow the threads of indigenous oral tradition, archaeology, and the physical evidence of the caves themselves, begins to converge on something uncomfortable. Something that the official narrative of North American prehistory has never had a good framework for addressing. There may have been a civilization, or the remnants of a civilization, operating in the cave systems beneath the Rocky Mountains before the cultures we know and study built their surface structures above. And the ancestral Puebloans, and the Hopi, and the Ute, and possibly other indigenous groups of the region, were not the originators of the underground tradition, they were the inheritors of it. They found the caves already marked, already shaped by hands older than their own culture, and they used them because the caves were already known to be significant. Because something had happened underground that made the underground sacred in a way that no one fully explained and no one fully forgot. Now let's go north, because the Rocky Mountain cave system doesn't end in the Four Corners. It continues through Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, into the ranges of the Canadian Rockies, and along this entire spine of mountains there are stories. Indigenous stories, explorer accounts, geological anomalies, and one discovery that, if it means what some researchers think it means, changes everything. In the late 1890s, a series of expeditions into the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming produced reports of cave systems that had not previously been included in any geological survey. The Bighorn region is sacred territory for several Plains tribes, most famously home to the Bighorn Medicine Wheel, a stone structure on a ridge at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet that represents one of the oldest and most carefully constructed astronomical alignments in North America. The Medicine Wheel predates the historical period of the Plains tribes who consider it sacred. It predates, in fact, the arrival of horses on the Great Plains, which means it was built by a people walking at that altitude, carrying stones to a precise location and arranging them in alignments to the summer solstice sunrise and sunset, and to specific bright stars that would have been significant to whatever astronomical tradition they practiced. Nobody knows who built it. The Crow people, who consider themselves the Medicine Wheel's traditional guardians, say it was made by people who came before them, made by people who were already old when the Crow arrived. The expedition reports from the 1890s describe cave entrances in the Bighorn Range that showed signs of modification. Not mining, not natural formation. Deliberate alteration of cave entrances in ways that suggested the cave openings had been made more accessible or more intentionally shaped. The expedition members, who were primarily interested in the region's mineral potential, noted these features and moved on. But one member of an 1,898 expedition, a geologist named Frederick Crandell, whose field notes survived in a university archive and were partially transcribed by a researcher in the 1970s, described something more specific. Crandell wrote about a cave entrance in a limestone formation in the northern Bighorn Range that had been faced with stones arranged in a manner he described as architectural. He noted that the stones were of a different composition than the surrounding formation and had clearly been brought from elsewhere. He described the interior of the cave as showing evidence of habitation, including what he believed to be the remnants of constructed interior walls and a floor surface that appeared to have been deliberately leveled. He estimated, without any scientific dating method, that the site had not been occupied in living memory, and perhaps not in the memory of anyone then living. He did not attempt to excavate. He did not return to the site. His notes describe it as a remarkable curiosity and move on to the mineral survey he was actually there to conduct. The site he described has never been formally identified, located, or studied. His description is too general for modern researchers to pinpoint the location with confidence. But Crandell was not the only person to describe architectural features in the Bighorn cave systems. A Crow elder, interviewed in the 1940s by an anthropologist working on reservation communities, described caves in the mountains that had been built by the Little People, a category of beings in Crow tradition that is sometimes interpreted as referring to very small humans, sometimes as spiritual beings, and sometimes, in the more historically minded interpretations, as the remnants of an earlier and shorter human population that inhabited the mountains before the Crow. The Little People in Plains indigenous traditions are a subject that mainstream anthropologists handle carefully. The traditions are widespread. They appear in Crow, Shoshone, Lakota, and other Plains tribal traditions, always describing small beings of great knowledge or power who lived in the mountains or underground, who built things that the current inhabitants of the land did not build, and who either vanished or retreated from the human world at some point in the distant past. In 1932, a discovery in a gold mine near Pedro Mountain in Wyoming temporarily made these traditions international news. Miners blasting through rock uncovered a small mummified figure sitting in a cross-legged position inside a small cavity in the rock. The figure was approximately 14 inches tall and appeared to the miners and to the early investigators who examined it to be the mummified remains of an adult human being of very small stature. The Pedro Mountain mummy, as it became known, was examined by Harvard physical anthropologist George Gill in the 1990s using X-ray analysis. Gill concluded that the mummy represented the remains of an adult male, probably in his 30s at time of death, with fully fused growth plates indicating physical maturity, who suffered from a condition that caused very small stature. He estimated the individual's height in life at approximately 14 to 17 inches. The mummy was eventually lost. It passed through private ownership and disappeared from documented record in the 1950s. Several other mummies of similar small stature were reportedly found in the Bighorn region at various points during the early 20th century. None survive in conditions that allow modern analysis. The reports of their discovery were documented in newspapers, but not in scientific literature. The pattern of discovery, brief attention, and disappearance is consistent with the broader pattern we have been tracing throughout this story. The indigenous traditions about small people living underground in the mountains, the architectural features in cave systems that do not match known historical cultures, the mummified remains suggesting physical types not consistent with the accepted anthropological record of the region. None of these pieces connect into a clean, definitive picture, but they cluster around the same question. The question of who was in these mountains before the cultures we know about arrived, and where they went. There is a cave in the Wind River Range of Wyoming that has been the subject of very quiet controversy in American archaeology since the 1960s, when a small excavation, led by an archaeologist whose name does not appear in any major institutional directory, produced a field report that circulated in typescript among a limited number of researchers before apparently vanishing from archival circulation. The excavation, described in the field report, uncovered 3 distinct occupation layers in the cave. The uppermost layer was consistent with historical period habitation, approximately 200 to 400 years old. The middle layer was consistent with earlier prehistoric habitation, approximately 2,000 to 3,000 years old. The lowest layer, separated from the middle layer by a sterile deposit of sediment indicating a gap in occupation, was dated by the excavator to approximately 14,000 to 16,000 years ago. In the lowest layer, the excavator described tools of a type not consistent with any known Paleo-Indian tradition, not Clovis, not pre-Clovis in any recognized typological category. Tools of a manufacturing technique that the excavator described as more sophisticated than expected for the period. Small, precise implements that suggested a level of tool-making skill inconsistent with the standard picture of Ice Age human technology in North America. The field report was never formally published. Requests to locate it in institutional archives in the decades since have produced nothing. The cave itself has been identified by some researchers as a specific location in the Wind River Range, but access to that location requires crossing land with complicated jurisdictional status, and formal excavation permits have not been issued. This is the nature of the Rocky Mountain Cave mystery. It does not exist as a single dramatic discovery. It exists as an accumulation of fragments, each one explicable in isolation, collectively suggesting something that cannot be explained within the boundaries of current accepted prehistory. Let's talk about what those fragments collectively suggest. The first thing they suggest is deep time. The cave systems beneath the Rocky Mountains are among the oldest continuous geological features on the continent. Some of the cave passages were formed tens of millions of years ago. Others formed more recently, over the past few million years, carved by water moving through limestone and dolomite formations during successive wet and dry climatic periods. The caves have been here for a very long time, long enough for human populations to have discovered them, used them, and left marks in them that subsequent geological processes have partially erased. The question of when humans first arrived on this continent is, despite what the textbooks suggest, genuinely open. The Clovis first hypothesis, which held that the first Americans arrived approximately 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly across the continent, has been substantially revised by a series of discoveries over the past 3 decades. The Monte Verde site in Chile has been securely dated to at least 14,500 years ago. The Paisley Caves in Oregon have produced human coprolites, fossilized human feces, dated to more than 14,000 years ago. The Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico has yielded stone tools dated to between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, though that dating remains contested. The accumulation of pre-Clovis evidence has forced a revision of the timeline, but not a complete reconsideration of its implications. The revised consensus now admits that humans were present in the Americas before 13,000 years ago, but continues to work within a framework that assumes these pre-Clovis populations were relatively small, unsophisticated in the conventional sense, and left limited archaeological footprints. The Rocky Mountain Cave evidence suggests this may be wrong, not in a sensational way, not in the way that ancient alien theorists would like it to be wrong, but wrong in a quieter, more interesting way. Wrong in the way that scientific revisions usually are. Not because the existing facts are incorrect, but because the framework used to interpret them is too small to contain all the facts that actually exist. The second thing the accumulated evidence suggests is continuity, not just human presence in the cave systems at various points over a very long period, but something more like a continuous tradition. A relationship between specific human communities and specific cave systems that persisted over millennia. The cave systems that show evidence of very ancient human presence are often the same cave systems that appear in indigenous oral traditions as sacred or significant. This is not a coincidence that can be easily dismissed. Oral traditions are not random. They preserve what communities have found worth preserving. A tradition that marks a specific cave as a place of emergence, or of encounter with beings who came before, or of underground habitation by ancestor peoples, is a tradition that is encoding real geographical and historical information in the symbolic language available to pre-literate cultures. The indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountain region did not invent their underground traditions from nothing. They inherited them from somewhere. The question of where those traditions came from, what actual historical events or geographical realities they encode, is a question that a serious archaeology of the Rocky Mountain cave systems would help to answer. But that archaeology has not been conducted. The reasons are complex. Some of them are practical. Cave archaeology is extraordinarily difficult, expensive, and slow. Some of them are political. Many of the cave systems of greatest potential interest lie on or near land managed by tribal nations, and the relationship between indigenous communities and academic archaeology is historically fraught enough that access is often complicated. Some of the reasons, however, are structural. The academic framework within which American archaeology operates has not created space for the questions that the Rocky Mountain cave evidence raises. The timeline is still organized around the Clovis First revision and its successors. The cultural history of the continent is still organized around the assumption that the oldest identifiable traditions are a few thousand years old at most. The possibility that there are cave systems beneath the Rockies containing evidence of human activity stretching back 15,000 or 20,000 years, evidence of sophisticated tool use, of constructed features, of sustained occupation during periods of catastrophic surface conditions, is a possibility that the profession is structurally unprepared to take seriously, and so the fragments accumulate. The unexplained walls, the anomalous tools, the markings in passages that no recent human has entered, the mummies that vanish into private collections, the field reports that circulate in typescript and then disappear, the indigenous traditions that point to specific places and specific histories that academic archaeology has not yet caught up with. Let's go to Colorado, because Colorado is where the cave mystery becomes most concrete, most specific, and most impossible to dismiss without a deliberate act of professional avoidance. The Spanish explorers who entered the Rocky Mountain region in the 16th and 17th centuries were looking for gold. They found, instead, a landscape already thick with evidence of previous human occupation. The cliff dwellings of the mesa country, the road networks of the canyon regions, the irrigation works of the valleys. They documented these things, imperfectly and through a cultural lens that prevented them from asking the right questions, but they documented them, and occasionally, in the margins of the official reports, in the private correspondence and diaries that survived alongside the formal documents, they described something else. They described caves. Not the cliff dwellings that would later become famous, not the open-air sites that are still visible from the road at Mesa Verde or Canyon de Chelly. They described deep cave systems that local indigenous guides told them about, systems that the guides were reluctant to enter or to discuss in detail, systems that were described as old in a way that set them apart from even the most ancient surface ruins. A Spanish expedition report from 1604, preserved in the Archive of the Indies in Seville and partially translated by historians in the 20th century, describes an encounter with a group of indigenous informants near what appears to be the San Juan River in southern Colorado. The informants described, through interpreters, a network of underground passages that they said had been made by beings who lived before the memory of their oldest stories. They described these passages as connecting multiple mountains in a system that allowed travel underground across distances that would take many days on the surface. The Spanish expedition leader, who recorded this information, treated it as legend. He was interested in gold, not in underground roads made by prehistorical beings. He noted the information, expressed polite interest, and moved on. But the description is interesting because it is specific. Not, there are caves in the mountains, which would be unremarkable. Not, our ancestors lived underground, which could be mythological. The description is of a connected network, passages linking multiple mountains, underground travel across significant distances. This is not the description of a single cave system. It is the description of infrastructure. Who builds underground infrastructure? Civilizations. Communities with the organizational capacity, the engineering knowledge, and the sustained motivation to undertake multi-generational construction projects of enormous difficulty. The standard model of North American prehistory does not have a place for an underground infrastructure building civilization in the Colorado Mountains in the period before European contact. The ancestral Puebloans built remarkable things on the surface. The Hohokam built irrigation networks of extraordinary sophistication, but neither of these cultures is associated with extensive underground construction in the manner the Spanish report describes, which takes us back to the question of who came before. There is a researcher, not affiliated with any major university, whose work occupies the uncomfortable space between serious scholarship and the kind of heterodox inquiry that mainstream institutions prefer to ignore. His name is not important for this story, but his methodology is. Over the course of 15 years, he has collected and cross-referenced every available account of Rocky Mountain cave systems that shows evidence of anomalous human activity. He has consulted indigenous oral traditions from more than a dozen tribal nations. He has reviewed the geological literature on cave formation in the Rockies. He has corresponded with archaeologists who have worked in the region and who, in private, express puzzlement at findings they cannot comfortably discuss in their official publications. His conclusion is not dramatic. It is careful, qualified, and framed with all the appropriate epistemic hedging, but its core claim is straightforward. He believes that the Rocky Mountain cave systems were used by a population of humans during the late Pleistocene, the period between roughly 20,000 and 12,000 years ago, who were more technologically sophisticated than the accepted model allows. He believes that this population survived the end Pleistocene climate catastrophe underground, emerged onto the surface during the early Holocene, and became, in some form, the ancestral population from which later indigenous cultures derived both their physical presence in the region and their traditions about underground origins. He is careful to say he does not believe this population was alien, or from a lost continent, or in any way supernatural. He believes they were human, fully human, and that the mystery is not about who they were in some cosmic sense, but about what they knew and what they built, and why the evidence of their existence has been so consistently overlooked or explained away. The question his work raises most insistently is one that archaeology has not fully answered. Why? Across so many different indigenous traditions in the Rocky Mountain region, is there such consistent and specific reference to a people who came before, who lived underground, who built things in the deep rock, and who either disappeared or transformed into something that is present, still in the land itself? The Ute people have a category of being called Nuche, which refers to the people, meaning themselves, but also has a historical valence that refers to peoples who were present in the mountains before the historical Ute arrived. The Nuche of old-time traditions are described as having specific knowledge of the mountain terrain, including knowledge of underground routes and chambers that the Ute themselves did not generate but inherited from the landscape. The mountains were already marked when the Ute arrived. The caves were already known. The Shoshone tradition includes references to tunnels that connect the mountain ranges, underground passages that were used for travel in the time before the current order of things. The Lakota describe the Black Hills as the navel of the earth, a sacred center that extends both upward into the sky and downward into the underground. The underground dimension of Black Hills' sacred geography is not merely metaphorical in Lakota tradition. It refers to actual physical passages in the limestone formations of the hills, some of which have been documented by geologists and some of which remain unexplored. Wind Cave itself, that extraordinary system of more than 150 mapped miles, is the site of one of the most important creation narratives in Lakota tradition. The Lakota say that their people emerged from Wind Cave, that the opening of the cave, a small hole near the cave's present entrance, is the Sipapu through which the first humans came into the world. The Lakota relationship with Wind Cave predates the modern Park Service. It predates the European discovery of the cave in the 1880s. It is a relationship described in traditions that are themselves of unknown age, traditions that the Lakota regard as extending back to the beginning of their existence as a people. What is notable about the Wind Cave tradition is not just its existence, but its specificity. The Lakota don't say their ancestors emerged from underground, somewhere in the mountains. They say they emerged from this cave, through this opening, and the land above the cave is sacred because of what the cave contains. This is the kind of specific geographical reference that oral traditions preserve when they are encoding real places, real events, real histories. Wind Cave is a real place. It is one of the most extraordinary cave systems on Earth. Its geological formations are unique in ways that science has documented and not fully explained. And it is the site of one of the oldest and most specific emergence narratives in indigenous North American tradition. What happened in Wind Cave? What is the tradition preserving? The geological answer is that the cave was formed over an enormous period of time by water working through limestone, and that its boxwork formations are the result of geological processes that operated across timescales of millions of years. This is true, and it is also not a complete answer to the question of what the Lakota tradition is encoding. The cave's existence is not the mystery. The tradition's specificity is the mystery. The claim of emergence, of the first people coming up through that particular hole in that particular cave, in that particular mountain, is a claim about history that deserves more than dismissal as mythology. Let's go even further north. Because the cave mystery beneath the Rocky Mountains extends into Montana and Idaho in ways that the formal archaeological record has barely begun to address, the Snake River Plain of Idaho sits on top of a volcanic formation of extraordinary complexity. The volcanic activity that created the Snake River Plain has also created an enormous network of lava tube caves, some of which are among the largest and longest lava tubes in the world. Craters of the Moon National Monument, which preserves the most dramatic surface features of the Snake River volcanism, contains a cave system that extends for miles and includes chambers large enough to have comfortably housed significant human populations. Evidence of human use of the Craters of the Moon cave system extends back to approximately 10,000 years ago, which is the oldest date in the formal archaeological record currently documents. But the cave system itself is far older. The lava tubes formed during volcanic eruptions that occurred between 15,000 and 2,000 years ago, with the oldest tubes dating to the earliest Holocene. If humans were in the region before 10,000 years ago, which the pre-Clovis evidence suggests is very possible, they would have encountered the lava tube system of the Snake River Plain as one of the most remarkable and accessible underground environments in North America. Large chambers, stable temperatures, protection from the extreme surface conditions of the late Pleistocene, water from underground sources, connected to the Snake River aquifer system, one of the largest underground water resources in North America. And yet the formal archaeology of the Craters of the Moon cave system essentially begins 10,000 years ago and does not look harder for evidence of earlier use. The caves below that date either were not occupied or do not preserve the evidence of their occupation in forms that current archaeological methods can detect. This is an interpretive choice as much as an empirical finding. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, particularly in cave systems where organic material from the oldest occupation levels may have been destroyed by later geological activity or simply not been searched for in the excavations that have been conducted. The Shoshone people, who are historically associated with the Snake River Plain and the mountains on its margins, have traditions about underground spaces in the lava country that describe them as significant, as places of power, as locations connected to their deepest ancestral memories. The specific content of these traditions is not public knowledge in detail. The Shoshone communities that hold them are protective of information they regard as sacred. But the existence of the traditions, the fact that the lava cave systems are embedded in Shoshone sacred geography, is itself significant. It suggests a relationship between this particular community and these particular underground spaces that is not recent, not casual, and not explained by the formal archaeological record alone. Moving into Montana, the cave archaeology becomes less well documented, which is partly a function of the sparseness of formal archaeological survey in some of the more remote mountain areas, and partly a function of the political complexity of working in areas with overlapping jurisdictional claims between state, federal, and tribal authority. But there are anomalies. In the 1980s, a speleologist conducting a solo survey of a cave system in the Absaroka Range near Yellowstone National Park discovered what he described in his survey notes as a series of chambers in the deepest reachable portion of the cave that showed what appeared to be intentional alteration. He described the walls of one chamber as showing tool marks inconsistent with natural erosion, and the floor of the chamber as showing a level surface that he found suspicious given the irregular nature of the surrounding passage floors. He submitted his survey notes to the Park Service and to a university cave research program. He received acknowledgement from both and no follow-up. He returned to the site the following year and found that access to the relevant passage had been blocked by a rockfall that he was not certain was entirely natural. He did not investigate further and did not publish his observations. This story, like so many in this account, is known only through secondary sources. The survey notes themselves, the acknowledgement letters, the follow-up correspondence have not been located. The speleologist, who is presumably still alive given the time period involved, has not spoken publicly about his discovery. The chamber he described has not been formally excavated or even formally documented. The pattern continues, the evidence accumulates, the connections multiply. And the official story of the Rocky Mountain cave systems remains substantially as it was 50 years ago. A geological wonder, a natural heritage site, a subject of formal study that has produced remarkable findings about cave formation, cave ecosystems, and prehistoric human habitation dating back several thousand years. No further, no deeper, no older. But the older questions don't go away. They live in the oral traditions of a dozen indigenous nations, in field reports that circulate in typescript and then vanish, in the notes of geologists who describe things they cannot explain and then move on to the next survey, in the work of researchers who operate at the margins of institutional affiliation and ask the questions that their more securely positioned colleagues cannot afford to ask. They live in the caves themselves, in the passages that have not been fully mapped, in the chambers that have not been formally excavated, in the rock walls that bear marks whose age has not been determined and whose meaning has not been investigated. The Rocky Mountains have been here for more than 60 million years. Human beings have been on this continent for at least 15,000 years, and possibly much longer. The caves beneath the mountains have been here for millions of years and have been accessible to any human population present in the region throughout the entire period of human occupation on the continent. What happened in those caves over all that time? Who was there? What did they build and mark and preserve? What did they know that made the underground worth going into? We do not have complete answers. We have fragments. We have traditions. We have anomalies in the geological and archaeological record that the official story has not accounted for. We have the caves themselves, most of them still unmapped, most of them still unexcavated, most of their secrets still sealed in the rock. The story of the Rocky Mountain Cave Network is not a story with an ending. It is a story with an opening. The opening is the question of what is actually down there, in the dark beneath the mountains, waiting for someone to ask the right question in the right place with the right kind of patience. And that question is one that the evidence demands we keep asking. Now, let's go into the specific evidence of underground construction, because this is where the theoretical becomes concrete, where the oral tradition meets the physical record, where the anomalies stop being curious and start being genuinely inexplicable within any framework that our current understanding can comfortably provide. There are documented cases of what appear to be constructed passages in Rocky Mountain cave systems that do not match any known indigenous architectural tradition, that show evidence of tool work inconsistent with the stone technology attributed to the cultures supposedly present in the region at the relevant time periods, and that exist in locations so remote and difficult of access that their construction would have represented a significant organizational achievement even for a modern, well-equipped expedition. One of the most thoroughly documented of these, though the documentation exists primarily in grey literature and independent research reports rather than in peer-reviewed publications, involves a cave system in the Uinta Mountains of northeastern Utah. The Uintas are the only major mountain range in the contiguous United States that runs east-west rather than north-south, a geographical anomaly that geologists attribute to the specific tectonic conditions under which the range was formed. The cave systems of the Uintas have been explored extensively by independent cavers since the 1960s, but have received relatively limited formal archaeological attention. In the deeper portions of one of the larger Uinta cave systems, a group of independent researchers in the early 2000s documented a section of passage that showed clear evidence of modification. The passage had been widened, not fractured, not naturally enlarged by water erosion, but systematically widened, with the evidence of tool work visible in the chisel marks on the walls. The marks were consistent with stone tool use rather than metal tool use, but they were precise and regular in a way that suggested practiced, organized labor rather than casual or experimental work. The widened passage led to a chamber that the researchers described as roughly circular in plan, with a domed ceiling and a floor that showed evidence of having been leveled. In the center of the chamber, there was a feature that they described as a low stone platform, constructed from fitted stones without mortar, approximately 2 feet high and 8 feet in diameter. The platform showed signs of use. The stone surface was worn smooth in ways consistent with repeated contact over a long period. The researchers took photographs. They collected no samples because they were not equipped for formal excavation and did not have the permits that would have authorized sample collection. They published their findings in an independent caving newsletter with limited circulation. The photographs exist. Several researchers who have seen them describe them as consistent with the written description. The cave system has been revisited by subsequent independent explorers, some of whom have confirmed the existence of the widened passage and the chamber. The platform has not been formally examined. The chisel marks have not been formally analyzed. The chamber has not been formally documented by any institutional body. Why? The reasons are the usual reasons. Access is difficult. The cave system does not fall neatly within any single jurisdiction. Formal excavation requires permits, funding, institutional sponsorship, and all of the bureaucratic architecture that independent researchers operating without institutional affiliation cannot provide. The institutional researchers who might provide that architecture are not particularly motivated to investigate a site that was first brought to their attention by independent cavers, and that exists at a depth of the cave system that would require significant logistical effort to reach. And so, the chamber sits, the platform sits, the chisel marks in the widened passage sit, waiting for someone with the combination of institutional standing, independent motivation, and sheer physical determination to reach them and examine them with the rigor they deserve. This is not unique to the Uintas. Versions of this situation exist in cave systems throughout the Rocky Mountain range. Features that have been documented by independent researchers, often photographed, sometimes described in published form in non-peer-reviewed outlets, and consistently not followed up by the institutional archaeology that would give the documentation credibility and the features proper analysis. The accumulation of these undocumented or inadequately documented features is one of the most significant unexplained phenomena in the study of North American prehistory, not because any single feature, examined in isolation, requires a dramatic revision of history, but because the pattern of their distribution, their characteristics, their relationship to indigenous traditions, and their consistent failure to receive formal investigation collectively suggests something that the informal record is preserving in fragments and the formal record is not asking about at all. What would a serious archaeological investigation of the Rocky Mountain cave systems reveal? The honest answer is we don't know. That's the point. We don't know because the investigation has not been conducted. The fragments we have are suggestive of occupation patterns more complex, more ancient, and more sophisticated than the current consensus acknowledges. But fragments are not findings. Suggestions are not conclusions. The investigation has to happen before we can know what it would reveal. What we can say is this: the physical cave systems are there. The evidence of anomalous human activity is there, documented in forms ranging from formal geological papers to indigenous oral traditions to independent researcher reports. The questions the evidence raises are legitimate questions that serious inquiry is capable of addressing, and the institutional structure of American archaeology has, for reasons that are partly practical and partly structural and partly political, not addressed them. The Rocky Mountain cave network beneath this ancient range of mountains is one of the great unexplored frontiers of American prehistory. Not unexplored in the literal sense. Caves have been entered, passages have been mapped, chambers have been found. But unexplored in the sense that matters most, the questions those explorations raise have not been systematically pursued, the anomalies they produce have not been adequately investigated, and the story they collectively tell, of human presence older and more complex than the official record acknowledges, has not yet been fully told. And there is one more dimension of this story that we have not yet addressed. One more layer beneath all the others. The layer that connects the caves to the sky. The indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountain region are not only cave-focused in their sacred geography, they are also astronomers. The medicine wheel of the Bighorn Mountains is the most famous example, but it is not the only one. Throughout the range, there are stone structures, petroglyphs, rock alignments, and site locations that demonstrate precise astronomical knowledge. Alignments to solstices and equinoxes. Alignments to specific stars and constellations. Site locations chosen for their astronomical sightlines in ways that reveal careful, sophisticated observation of the sky carried out over long periods of time. The connection between astronomical knowledge and cave systems is not obvious, but it is real. In cultures around the world, The underground has been associated with the sky, the cave as a representation of the cosmos, the passage through the earth as a journey through the heavens, the underground chamber as a place where the movements of celestial bodies could be observed in their relationship to the earth. The Chaco Canyon great houses were built with astronomical alignments built into their architecture. The kivas of the ancestral Puebloans were oriented to astronomical events. The underground world and the astronomical world were connected in the ceremonial geography of these cultures in ways that we have only partially mapped. Is it possible that some of the cave systems beneath the Rocky Mountains were used, at some point in their occupation history, as places of astronomical observation or astronomical record-keeping? The question sounds strange, but the evidence does not entirely dismiss it. Some of the chambers that have been described as showing evidence of deliberate construction are in locations relative to the surface that would allow specific astronomical events to be observed from underground through the cave. Openings. The winter solstice sunrise, which is the most significant astronomical event in the ceremonial calendar of many Puebloan traditions, can be observed from the interior of specific caves. This is a choice. If these chambers were constructed by deliberate human agency, the orientation of the cave opening relative to astronomical events would have been a consideration in the construction. The astronomical dimension of the cave mystery is perhaps the most speculative layer of this account. It requires not just the existence of constructed features in cave systems, which is already beyond the formal record, but also the existence of a community with both the engineering capacity to construct underground chambers and the astronomical knowledge to orient them correctly. This is a high bar for a community operating in the pre-Columbian period in North America by the standards of the conventional historical record. But the conventional historical record is precisely what is in question here. The Chaco Canyon astronomical alignments, which are formally documented and widely accepted, demonstrate that there were people in this region in the period from roughly 800 to 1150 CE who had sophisticated astronomical knowledge and the organizational capacity to build structures that encoded that knowledge. If the communities whose traditions point to underground origins, to ancient occupants of the cave systems, were in some continuity with the Chaco culture or its predecessors, then the combination of cave construction and astronomical knowledge is not implausible. It is the natural expression of a culture that had been developing both capacities over a very long time. The story of the Rocky Mountain Cave Network is, in the end, the story of what we don't know about this continent. It is the story of how the official narrative of American prehistory was constructed during a period when the methods for investigating it were limited, and how that narrative has calcified into something that is now difficult to revise, even as better methods produce better evidence. It is the story of indigenous communities who have preserved, in their oral traditions and their sacred geographies, information about the deep past of this continent that academic archaeology has not adequately listened to. It is the story of researchers who have found anomalies in the physical record and been unable to pursue them through the institutional channels that would give their findings credibility. It is the story of caves, deep and ancient and mostly unmapped, beneath mountains that have stood for 60 million years and watched everything that has happened above and below them. And it is, most importantly, a story that is not finished. The caves are still there. The questions are still there. The fragments of evidence are still there, scattered through the grey literature and the field reports and the oral traditions, waiting to be assembled into something more complete than any single account has yet managed. What is beneath the Rocky Mountains? Who was there before the cultures we know? What did they build, and what did they know, and where did they go? We do not know, but we have not stopped asking. And the asking, the refusal to accept the official silence on these questions, is how the answers eventually come. The mountains keep their secrets patiently. They have been keeping them for millions of years. They will keep them until someone finds the right combination of courage, rigor, and resources to go deep enough and ask carefully enough and listen to what the rock and the tradition and the evidence together are saying. That combination has not yet arrived, but it is coming. And when it does, the story of the Rocky Mountain Cave Network will not be a mystery any longer. It will be a history, the oldest history on this continent, written in stone, in bone, in the marks of tools older than any culture we have named, in the traditions of people who never forgot where they came from, even when the world above forgot to ask. The mountains are waiting. The caves are waiting. The question is waiting. And we are still, as we have always been, the species that cannot resist the question, the species that goes into the dark to find out what is there. That is, perhaps, the most important thing the cave mystery tells us. Not about who lived underground in the Pleistocene, not about what tools they used or what structures they built, but about what kind of creature we are. The kind that descended into the earth with fire and curiosity, and the stubborn insistence that the darkness must contain something worth knowing. Whatever is beneath the Rocky Mountains, we will find it. Because that is what we do. We find things. Even the things that have been waiting for us for 15,000 years. The caves are patient. We are persistent. The truth, whatever it is somewhere in the dark between those two facts. And that, in the end, is why this story matters. Not because it gives us answers, but because it reminds us how many questions we are still living with. How much of this continent's history is still sealed in the rock beneath our feet. How many stories are waiting in the dark for someone to come with the right kind of light. There are thousands of unmapped passages in the Rocky Mountain cave systems. Thousands of chambers that no human has entered in recorded history, and many that no human may have entered since the last people who knew the underground routes either died or forgot the way in. Those passages are real. Those chambers are real. The evidence of human presence in some of them is real, documented in fragments scattered across a literature that the official history of this continent has not yet assembled into a coherent account. Assembling that account is the work ahead. It is the work of serious archaeology, conducted without the constraints of a narrative that has already decided what it will find. It is the work of listening to indigenous traditions, with the kind of careful attention that recognizes oral history as a form of record-keeping, not as mythology to be decoded, but as memory to be respected. It is the work of going into the caves with the right questions and the patience to let the evidence answer them on its own terms. Until that work is done, the Rocky Mountain Cave Network remains what it has always been, a mystery at the heart of American prehistory, a question written in stone, a story that the Earth has been telling for a very long time to anyone willing to go deep enough to listen. The dark is full of history. We just haven't learned to read it yet. And maybe that is the most remarkable thing about all of this. Not the caves themselves, extraordinary as they are. Not the anomalies in the archaeological record, suggestive as they are. Not the indigenous traditions, specific and insistent as they are. The most remarkable thing is how long the question has been waiting, how patiently the rock has held the evidence, how consistently the traditions have preserved the memory, how persistently the anomalies have refused to be explained away. Something happened beneath these mountains, something old, something complex, something that the official history of this continent has not yet found the courage or the methods or the will to fully address. That something is waiting, in the dark, in the deep rock, in the unmarked passages of cave systems that have not been mapped, in the traditions of communities that have not been listened to carefully enough. It is waiting for us to be ready, to be willing, to go down into the dark without a predetermined answer and find out what is actually there. The Rocky Mountains have kept their secret long enough. The question now is whether we are ready to find out what it is. That is where this story ends. Not with an answer, with a direction. Down, into the caves, into the rock, into the oldest history on this continent, into the dark where the truth has been waiting, with the patience of mountains, for someone to finally come and find it. But going down is only the beginning of the story. Because the cave networks beneath the Rocky Mountains are not simply geological formations that humans happen to use, they are, if the evidence is taken seriously and assembled with care, the site of something that changes the way we understand this entire continent's history. And understanding how and why requires us to follow not just the physical evidence, but the shape of the question itself, the way it has moved through time, the way it has been asked and suppressed and asked again, the way it keeps coming back, no matter how many times the official record attempts to close the book on it. Let's talk about water, because in any serious discussion of cave habitation across extended periods, water is the central fact. A community that lives underground needs water. It cannot survive without it. And the question of where underground communities in the Rocky Mountain cave systems would have found reliable water sources is actually one of the most important and least discussed dimensions of this entire mystery. The answer, it turns out, is everywhere. The Rocky Mountain cave systems are intimately connected to the continent's underground water infrastructure in ways that geologists have documented and the general public has largely not absorbed. The Rocky Mountains sit astride the continental divide. Water falling on the western slopes feeds the Colorado River system and ultimately flows to the Pacific. Water falling on the eastern slopes feeds the Missouri and Arkansas river systems and ultimately reaches the Gulf of Mexico. But before any of that water reaches the surface rivers, a substantial portion of it moves underground through the limestone and dolomite formations that make up a large part of the Rocky Mountain geology. The underground water table beneath the Rockies is not a single aquifer. It is a system of interconnected formations, some shallow, some deep, some slow-moving, some flowing at speeds that would surprise anyone who imagines underground water as static. In some regions of the Rockies, underground springs emerge in cave systems at rates of hundreds of gallons per minute, producing reliable water sources that have been flowing continuously for thousands of years. A community occupying cave systems in the Rocky Mountains during the late Pleistocene would have had access to these underground water sources. The water would have been cold, extremely cold by modern standards, as all underground spring water in the region is, but it would have been reliable in a way that surface water sources were not during a period of rapid climate change. The glaciation cycle that characterized the late Pleistocene produced extreme variability in surface water availability. Rivers flooded catastrophically during melt events and dried to trickles during cold, dry periods. Underground springs, fed by much slower-moving water tables, would have remained relatively stable throughout this variability. This is not a trivial point. It means that an underground community during the Pleistocene would have had a resource advantage over surface communities in one of the most critical dimensions of survival. They would have had water, reliable, consistent, year-round water. This is a potential selective advantage for underground habitation, significant enough to drive sustained occupation of cave systems, even under conditions of significant difficulty and discomfort. Now, combine this with the thermal advantage we have already discussed. Cave temperatures in the Rocky Mountain systems stay between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. During the Wisconsin glaciation, the last great ice advance in North America, surface temperatures in the Rocky Mountain region dropped to levels that would have made prolonged surface habitation extremely difficult, without the kind of insulated shelter technology that is not documented in the American archaeological record for this period. Underground, the temperature was cold but survivable, cold but consistent, cold but protective of both human bodies and the food stores, the preserved plant materials, the dried meats, and stored nuts and processed roots that would have sustained a community through the worst of the glacial winter. The combination of reliable water and stable temperature makes the Rocky Mountain cave systems one of the most survivable environments on the continent during the worst periods of the last glacial maximum. Not comfortable, not easy, but survivable in a way that the exposed surface was not. If there were humans on this continent before the accepted arrival date, and the evidence increasingly suggests there were, where would they have been during the worst of the glacial conditions? The caves are the most logical answer. The caves that the formal record consistently underinvests in investigating, the caves that the indigenous traditions consistently mark as places of origin and emergence, the caves that the anomalous physical evidence consistently points to as sites of organized human activity older than the accepted timeline. The caves. Let's talk about what cognitive science tells us about the significance of underground spaces to early human communities, because this is another dimension of the mystery that the purely archaeological approach tends to underweigh. There is a well-documented phenomenon in the study of prehistoric cave art, particularly in Europe, but increasingly recognized in North American contexts as well, that the deepest and most elaborate artistic expressions consistently appear in the most difficult-to-reach portions of cave systems. The famous paintings of Lascaux and Altamira in Europe are in deep cave chambers that required sustained effort to reach. The extraordinary art of Chauvet Cave, some of the oldest known cave art in the world, at roughly 36,000 years before present, is not at the cave entrance. It is deep inside, in chambers that required navigation of narrow passages, careful fire management, and sustained physical effort to access. This is not a distribution pattern that makes sense if cave art was casual decoration. It makes sense if cave art was ceremonial activity, if the act of going deep into the cave was itself part of the significance of the experience, if the difficulty of access was inseparable from the meaning of what was done at the destination. The cave as a place of encounter with the sacred, with the ancestral, with the dimensions of reality not accessible on the surface, is one of the most widespread and persistent concepts in human religious and ceremonial life. It appears in traditions separated by tens of thousands of miles and thousands of years of cultural distance. It appears in the Paleolithic art of Europe and the kiva architecture of the American Southwest, and the cave rituals of indigenous Australian communities, and the underground temple complexes of ancient Mesoamerica, and the cave shrines of Himalayan Buddhist traditions. This universality is not a coincidence. It reflects something about the actual phenomenology of cave experience, the way that darkness, enclosure, the sounds of underground water, the absence of external light, and the weight of stone above all, combine to produce states of consciousness that human beings across all cultures and periods have found spiritually significant. Underground is where the deep self speaks. Underground is where the world of the surface falls away. Underground is where the ordinary distinctions between waking and dreaming, between the living and the ancestral dead, between the individual and the community, become permeable in ways that surface life suppresses. This phenomenology would have been available to any community that spent significant time in the Rocky Mountain cave systems, not as a side effect, but as a central feature of underground life. The experience of living underground produces specific kinds of consciousness, specific relationships to time and space and community that differ from surface experience in ways that are documented in the psychology of modern cavers, and that would have been far more acute for communities living underground as a primary mode of existence. What emerged from such communities, what they brought back to the surface, would have been shaped by the underground experience in fundamental ways. Their understanding of the sacred geography of the mountains would have incorporated the underground dimension as central, not peripheral. Their ceremonial practices would have encoded the underground experience in forms that persisted even after the community returned to surface habitation. Their stories about origin and emergence would have been grounded in the physical reality of having actually emerged from underground, not as a metaphor, but as a lived historical memory. This is what the Hopi emergence narrative may be preserving. This is what the Lakota relationship with Wind Cave may be encoding. This is what the widespread indigenous traditions about underground peoples, about ancestors who came from below, about sacred passages through the earth, may collectively represent, not mythology, memory. Encoded in the only form available to communities without writing, stories, rituals, sacred geographies, the deliberate preservation of specific places as significant across generations too long to enumerate. And now, let's bring this into sharper focus by talking about what we actually know, in the most rigorous and documented sense, about the timeline of human occupation in the Rocky Mountain region. The oldest formally accepted evidence of human presence in the Rocky Mountain region dates to approximately 13,000 years ago, consistent with the post-Clovis revision of the North American timeline. But there are sites in the broader region that push the evidence further back. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which is not in the Rockies but is relevant to the broader question of pre-Clovis presence in North America, has been dated to at least 16,000 years ago, with some evidence suggesting occupation as early as 19,000 years before present. The site has been intensely scrutinized by archaeologists looking for reasons to reject the early dates, and has consistently survived that scrutiny. The Cooper's Ferry site in Idaho, in the Snake River corridor that forms one of the natural approaches to the Rocky Mountain interior from the Pacific coast, has been dated to approximately 16,000 years ago. This is one of the most significant pre-Clovis sites in western North America and sits in the geographical corridor that populations moving inland from the Pacific coast would have followed toward the Rockies. The Rimrock Draw rock shelter in Oregon has produced ochre-stained artifacts at levels dated to approximately 18,000 years ago, though the dating and its implications remain actively debated. Taken together, these sites establish that humans were in the American West at least 16,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. They were in the region during the worst of the glacial maximum. They were navigating environments of extreme difficulty, and they are documented in rock shelters and coastal approaches, the kinds of sites that preserve evidence most readily. The cave systems of the Rocky Mountain interior are not the kinds of sites that preserve evidence most readily. Deep cave systems present enormous challenges for archaeological investigation. Organic material decays faster in humid underground environments than in the dry conditions that preserve desert rock shelter sites so well. Water infiltration disturbs stratigraphy. Animal activity, particularly by bears, which have used many Rocky Mountain cave systems as denning sites for thousands of years, churns and scatters the archaeological record. The sheer depth of some of the relevant passages makes conventional excavation impractical, but these challenges are not insuperable. They require different methods, more patience, more specialized expertise. The fact that they have not been overcome is not evidence that the evidence doesn't exist. It is evidence that the investigation has not been adequately resourced and motivated. Here is what a properly resourced investigation of a selection of the most promising Rocky Mountain cave sites might tell us within a decade of serious effort. It would produce a reliable timeline of human presence in the cave systems that extends at least as far back as the Cooper's Ferry and Meadowcroft dates, and possibly further. It would clarify whether the anomalous features documented by independent researchers, the constructed walls, the leveled chambers, the platform structures, the widened passages, represent genuine archaeological features or misidentified natural formations. It would allow systematic sampling of the oral traditions of Rocky Mountain indigenous communities, conducted in genuine partnership with those communities, that could identify which specific caves and features the traditions are pointing to and what historical information the traditions may be preserving. It would produce a geographically and temporally coherent account of who was in the Rocky Mountain cave systems during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, what they were doing there, and how their cave experience shaped the cultures that emerged from it. This investigation would change the history of North America, not in a sensational way, not by proving aliens or lost continents or anything that exists outside the bounds of normal historical inquiry, but by extending and deepening and complicating the account we have, by showing that the first chapter of American human history is substantially older and richer and more complex than the current textbook account acknowledges. The academic archaeology of North America is capable of this investigation. It has the methods. It has, in aggregate, the expertise. What it has lacked, consistently, is the institutional motivation to ask the questions that would make the investigation necessary. That motivation has to come from outside the institutional structure. It has to come from the public's insistence that the full history of this continent matters, that the oral traditions of indigenous peoples deserve the same respect as written documents, that the anomalies in the physical record deserve investigation rather than dismissal, that the questions the Rocky Mountain Cave Network raises are questions worth the resources and the professional risk required to answer them. The history is there, beneath our feet, in the dark, in the passages that have been waiting for 15,000 years or more for someone to come with the right questions and the right tools and the right humility to listen to what the rock has been trying to say. Now, let's go into the specifics of one more location, because abstraction serves the mystery, but specificity serves the truth. And there is one location in the Rocky Mountain Cave Network that deserves particular attention, that concentrates many of the threads we have been following into a single geographical point, that has been consistently significant in indigenous tradition, consistently anomalous in the physical record, and consistently under-investigated by formal archaeology. The Black Canyon of the Gunnison in southwestern Colorado is one of the most dramatic geological features in North America. The canyon reaches depths of 2,700 feet in places, with walls so steep and so close together that the canyon bottom receives only minutes of direct sunlight each day. The Gunnison River, which carved the canyon over 2 million years, still flows at the bottom, a narrow, powerful thread of water in the deepest cleft in the Colorado Plateau. What is less well known about the Black Canyon is what it connects to. The Gunnison River, as it approaches and enters the Black Canyon, flows through a region underlain by an extraordinarily complex geological formation that includes both granite, the canyon walls themselves, and extensive limestone formations in the surrounding uplands. The limestone formations of the surrounding region contain cave systems. Not the famous tourist caves, not the well-documented systems of the neighboring San Juan Mountains, but smaller, less explored, less documented systems that connect the canyon region to the broader underground geography of the Colorado Plateau. The Ute people, for whom the Black Canyon region is sacred territory, have a specific tradition about the canyon that describes it not merely as a geographical feature but as an entrance, a point of transition between the surface world and the underground world. The canyon itself, in Ute tradition, is a place where the worlds are thin, where the boundary between surface and underground, between the living and the ancestral, is permeable in ways that other locations are not. This is consistent with the physical geography. The Black Canyon is, in a geological sense, literally an entrance into the underground structure of the Colorado Plateau. The walls expose rock layers that are normally deep beneath the surface. The river at the bottom is flowing through the interior of the plateau in a way that makes the underground geography visible and accessible in a manner normally not possible. The canyon is, by the most literal interpretation, a place where the underground comes to the surface. Archaeological surveys of the Black Canyon region have documented human presence in the canyon and its approaches going back several thousand years. The ancestral Puebloans used the canyon region. The Fremont culture, a less well-documented but significant pre-Columbian civilization of the Colorado Plateau, was present in the region. The Ute have been in the area for at least 2,000 years, and probably longer, but in the limestone formations of the uplands surrounding the canyon, there are cave systems that have not been formally surveyed, that have not been excavated, that have been consistently identified in indigenous tradition as significant, and that show, in the limited informal documentation that exists of their interiors, characteristics consistent with the pattern we have been tracing throughout this account. Constructed features, evidence of toolwork, features inconsistent with known historical cultures, evidence of sustained occupation at depths that imply deliberate rather than casual use. The Black Canyon is not the only such location. The San Juan Mountains to the east have cave systems with similar characteristics. The Colorado Plateau to the west has cave systems with similar characteristics. The entire region that was the heartland of ancestral Puebloan civilization is underlain by a geological formation, the Colorado Plateau, that is more extensively cavernous than the surface terrain would suggest, and that contains cave systems which have been consistently significant in the sacred geography of the cultures that lived above them. What is beneath the Colorado Plateau? How deep does the cave system go? How far does it extend? Who was in it, and when, and what did they do there? These are the questions that the formal record has not answered. These are the questions that the indigenous traditions keep pointing toward. These are the questions that the anomalous physical evidence keeps raising, and the institutional archaeology keeps not following up on. The Colorado Plateau is the floor of an ancient sea. It is built from sedimentary rock laid down over hundreds of millions of years, rock that is both geologically ancient and geologically permeable, rock through which water has been moving and cave systems forming for a very long time. The cave systems of the Colorado Plateau are not well mapped. The ones that are famous, Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, the cave systems of the Guadalupe Mountains, are at the southeastern edge of the plateau. The interior of the plateau, the vast expanse of canyon country in Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, contains cave systems that geologists know about in general terms, but that have not been systematically explored. This is not a small area. The Colorado Plateau covers approximately 130,000 square miles. It is one of the most distinctive geological features on the North American continent. And its cave systems are largely unmapped, largely unexplored, largely outside the formal inventory of sites that American archaeology has systematically investigated. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network extends into this plateau. The systems are connected geologically, connected hydrologically through the underground water table, and connected culturally through the indigenous traditions that treat the entire region as a unified sacred geography. What would a full mapping of the cave systems of the Colorado Plateau and Rocky Mountains reveal? What features would a systematic survey of the most promising sites uncover? What would the indigenous communities of the region be able to tell serious, respectful, well-prepared researchers about the locations and significance of the underground features their traditions have preserved? We don't know, because the investigation hasn't been done, because the questions haven't been asked with sufficient rigor and sufficient respect, because the institutional structure of American archaeology has not made the deep history of this continent's underground spaces a priority. But the potential is there. The physical evidence is there. The oral historical record is there. The geographical features are there, accessible to modern explorers and archaeologists who are willing to put in the effort required to reach them. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network is not a dead end. It is an invitation. An invitation to go deeper, to ask harder questions, to listen to the voices that have been saying the same things for as long as anyone can remember, to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when where it leads is somewhere the official story hasn't gone. The invitation has been standing for a long time. The only question is, who will accept it? And there is one more thing worth saying, one more dimension of this mystery that circles back to the beginning, to the question of why it matters. Why the story of the Rocky Mountain Cave Network is not just an archaeological curiosity, but something that touches on the fundamental question of what we know about ourselves. Every human civilization that has ever existed on this planet has developed some relationship to the underground. The Egyptians built their most sacred structures below ground, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings carved into living rock. The ancient Greeks placed their most significant oracles in cave systems, the Delphic oracle in a cleft in the rock of Parnassus. The Romans built their most intimate religious spaces underground, the Mithraea of the mystery cults, carved into caves and basements and underground chambers throughout the empire. The Buddhist traditions of Central Asia placed their most sacred scriptures and images in cave temples. The Hindu tradition describes the earth as layered with underground worlds of enormous significance. The indigenous traditions of every continent on earth, without exception, include some form of reverence for the underground, some tradition of sacred underground space, some narrative about emergence from below. This universality is not a coincidence. It is not the product of diffusion, of one tradition spreading to all the others. It is the expression of something deeper, something that is part of what we are as a species. The relationship to the underground, the recognition that the earth is not simply a flat surface we walk on, but a dimensional structure with depth and darkness and significance, is one of the oldest and most persistent elements of human consciousness. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network is part of this story. It is the North American chapter of a global human relationship to the underground that is as old as human consciousness itself. The indigenous traditions that mark specific caves as sacred, that describe emergence from underground as the beginning of the people's story, that encode the underground geography of the mountains as a spiritual landscape, are not departures from some rational norm. They are expressions of one of the deepest and most universal human tendencies. The recognition that what is below us matters as much as what is above, that the dark contains as much of the truth as the light, that the full story of where we come from requires us to look down as well as up. The archaeologists who invest in the serious investigation of the Rocky Mountain cave systems will not just be advancing the timeline of American prehistory, they will be participating in one of the oldest human activities, the descent into the underground in search of what is real and what is true and what has been waiting in the dark for someone with the courage to go find it. That descent is overdue. The evidence is there. The traditions point the way. The caves are open. The question is whether we are ready to go in. And perhaps that question is one we should each be sitting with right now, in whatever part of the world you're listening from, in whatever hour of the night or day has brought you to this story. The Rocky Mountain caves are real. The anomalies are real. The traditions are real. The questions are real. What is beneath those ancient mountains? Who was there before anyone we have named? What did they know that we have forgotten? The caves are patient. They will wait. They have been waiting for 15,000 years or more. The only variable is when we decide that the question matters enough to pursue the answer. That decision is ours. And it is one of the most important decisions in the ongoing story of who we are and where we came from. Because this continent's history did not begin with the European arrival. It did not begin with the Clovis hunters. It did not begin at the Bering Land Bridge. It began earlier, deeper, and more richly than any official account has yet acknowledged. And some of the oldest pages of that history are written in the rock beneath the Rocky Mountains, in caves that have been sacred and significant, and alive with human meaning for longer than any account we have been given has dared to suggest. They are waiting to be read. The darkness of those caves is not the darkness of absence. It is the darkness of presence, of accumulated time, of history sealed in stone and preserved in tradition, and expressed in the stubborn refusal of the question to stay closed. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the ancient world. But it is not unsolvable. It is unasked. And the difference between those two things is everything. The questions are there. The evidence is there. The caves are there. All that remains is the descent. Into the dark, into the deep rock, into the oldest story on this continent, into the answer that has been waiting with the patience of mountains for us to be ready to hear it. That readiness begins with knowing the question exists, with understanding that the official story has gaps wide enough to contain entire civilizations, with listening to the traditions that have been marking these caves as significant for longer than our recorded history can reach, with taking seriously the physical evidence that the formal record has not adequately explained, and with the recognition that this story is not finished, that the caves are still there, that the passages are still unmapped, that the traditions are still speaking, that the anomalies are still waiting for the investigation they deserve. The mystery of the Rocky Mountain Cave Network is not a closed case. It is an open invitation, and somewhere in the dark beneath those ancient mountains, the invitation is still standing, waiting for the right question, waiting for the right expedition, waiting for the right moment when the world decides that the deep history of this continent matters enough to go looking for it. That moment may be closer than we think. The methods are there. The evidence is there. The traditions are there. The caves are there. All that remains is the will. And the will, in the end, begins with the story, with the telling of it, with the decision to take it seriously, to follow it where it leads, to not close the book before the last chapter has been written. That chapter is underground, in the dark, in the ancient rock, in the places where the first people of this continent may have sheltered and built and wondered at the same mysteries we are still wondering at today. The caves are patient. The mountains are patient. The question is patient. We are the ones who are running out of time. And so the story continues, not into silence, into the next question, into the next descent, into the next moment of courage that makes the darkness less absolute. The Rocky Mountains hold their secrets, but they are not closed. They are waiting, as they have always waited, for the right kind of human curiosity to find its way inside. That curiosity is alive in every person who listens to this story and feels something shift, some intuition that the official account is not the complete account, some recognition that the questions this evidence raises are questions worth taking seriously. That shift is the beginning of the investigation that this continent's oldest history deserves. The caves are there, the evidence is there, the traditions are there, the story is not over. It is just beginning. There is a geological term that most people have never heard, and it describes something so relevant to this story that it deserves a careful explanation before we continue. The term is speleogenesis. It refers to the process by which caves form. And the reason it matters for this story is that understanding how the Rocky Mountain cave systems formed tells us something important about when they became habitable, and therefore when they could have become significant for human populations. There are two primary mechanisms of speleogenesis in the Rocky Mountain region. The first is epigenic cave formation, which is the process most people associate with caves, water from the surface moving downward through cracks and joints in limestone, dissolving the rock as it goes, gradually enlarging the passages until they become navigable. This is a slow process. Most of the major cave systems in the Rockies formed primarily through this mechanism over periods ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions of years. The second mechanism is hypogenic cave formation, which works from below. In hypogenic caves, water moves upward from depth, driven by geothermal pressure, carrying dissolved gases, including hydrogen sulfide and carbon dioxide, that are far more aggressive at dissolving limestone than surface water. Lechuguilla Cave in New Mexico, which we discussed earlier, is the most famous hypogenic cave in North America. It formed from below, carved upward by hydrogen sulfide-laden water rising from a deep petrochemical source. Its extraordinary formations, the massive gypsum crystal fields that make it look like something from another planet, are the product of this unusual chemistry. Why does this matter for our story? Because hypogenic caves are often the oldest accessible underground spaces in a region, because they form independently of surface drainage patterns, meaning they can exist in geological formations where you would not predict caves from surface observation, and because the regions of the Rocky Mountains where hypogenic cave formation has been documented are some of the same regions where the anomalous archaeological features and the indigenous sacred geography point most consistently. The Four Corners region, which sits at the intersection of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, has a subsurface geology that includes both epigenic and hypogenic cave formation. The Colorado Plateau itself, beneath its canyon country surface, contains extensive hypogenic cave systems that are connected to deep geothermal activity. Some of these systems have never been formally mapped. Some of them have not been entered by any documented modern explorer. Some of them surface in the form of springs and seeps in the canyon country, places where the underground water table meets the surface in locations that indigenous traditions have consistently marked as significant. Sacred springs. The connection between sacred geography and water sources is one of the most universal patterns in human cultural history. Every tradition marks certain water sources as especially significant, as places where the ordinary and the sacred intersect, as entry points for the underground world. In the Four Corners region, the springs and seeps of the canyon country are embedded in Puebloan and Hopi and Navajo sacred geography in ways that have been documented by ethnographers, but not adequately connected to the underlying geology that explains their physical significance. The springs are significant because they are the surface expression of a vast underground water system. They are the places where the underground comes up. They are, by the most literal physical interpretation, the points where the underground world touches the surface world. The traditions that mark them as sacred are encoding a physical truth about the landscape in the language of the sacred, the only language available for communicating information of deep importance across generations in oral cultures. And the cave systems that feed those springs are the underground infrastructure that makes them possible. Cave systems that, we have been arguing throughout this account, were accessed and used and marked, and in some cases constructed by human communities whose presence in the region predates the accepted archaeological timeline. The water story and the cave story are the same story. The underground water network and the underground cave network are the same network, looked at from different directions. The indigenous traditions that mark springs as sacred and caves as places of emergence are pointing to the same landscape feature. The underground geography of the Colorado Plateau and encoding the same historical information, that the underground is where the oldest part of the human story in this region happened. Now, let's talk about something that the academic literature has discussed with great care, but has not fully resolved. The question of what happened to the populations that were present on this continent before the Younger Dryas event. The Younger Dryas was a period of rapid, severe climate cooling that occurred approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, following a period of warming at the end of the last ice age. The cooling was sudden on a geological timescale. Average temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within decades. The ice sheets, which had been retreating, stopped their retreat, and in some regions advanced again. The continent-wide disruption of climate, vegetation, and animal life that accompanied the Younger Dryas was one of the most severe environmental events of the Holocene. The question of what caused the Younger Dryas has been debated extensively. The most widely accepted mechanism is a massive influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic from the rapid drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz. disrupting the thermohaline circulation that drives the Atlantic heat pump and plunging the northern hemisphere into a brief but severe cold period. Alternative hypotheses include a cosmic impact event, a large-scale wildfire event, or a combination of factors. The evidence for the precise mechanism is still being assembled. But whatever caused the Younger Dryas, its effects on human populations in North America were severe. The megafauna extinctions that characterize the end of the Pleistocene in North America, the loss of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses and camels, and the great cats that preyed on them, cluster in and around the Younger Dryas period. The human populations that depended on these animals for a significant part of their subsistence would have been catastrophically disrupted. A community that had established underground refugia in the Rocky Mountain cave systems before the Younger Dryas onset would have had advantages not available to purely surface-dwelling communities. The cave temperature stability that made the underground habitable during the glacial maximum would have been equally valuable during the Younger Dryas. The underground water sources that sustained cave communities during the dry periods of the glacial maximum would have remained reliable during the Younger Dryas. The food storage capacity that underground caves provided, the ability to cache preserved food against periods of surface scarcity, would have been critical during a sudden return to glacial conditions. This is speculative. All discussion of what happened to pre-Clovis populations in North America is necessarily speculative at this stage, because the evidence is fragmentary and the formal investigation of the most relevant archaeological contexts has not been conducted. But the speculation is not arbitrary. It follows from the physical realities of the cave systems, the documented evidence of pre-Clovis human presence in the region, and the indigenous traditions that consistently describe the underground as the place from which their ancestors emerged into the current world order. What we may be dealing with in the Rocky Mountain Cave Network is the physical site of one of the most significant events in North American human history, the survival of a human population through the Younger Dryas event in underground refugia, and the subsequent emergence of that population or its descendants onto the surface of a continent, transformed by 1,200 years of severe climate disruption. The emergence traditions of the Hopi, the Lakota, the Ute, and other Rocky Mountain indigenous cultures may be encoding the memory of this event. The specific caves and cave systems that these traditions mark as sacred may be the actual locations of the underground refugia through which their ancestors survived. The constructed features, the modified passages, the leveled chambers, and stone platforms that have been documented in fragments throughout the cave systems may be the physical remnants of that survival, the infrastructure of communities that lived underground long enough to build, to mark, to organize their underground world as a real place of habitation rather than temporary shelter. This is not a fantastical claim. It is a hypothesis grounded in physical geography, climate history, human behavioral ecology, and indigenous oral tradition. It is a hypothesis that a properly designed archaeological investigation of the most promising Rocky Mountain cave sites could begin to test within a decade. The hypothesis would be tested by finding occupation debris at the right stratigraphic levels in the right cave systems. By dating organic material from those levels to the period straddling the Younger Dryas event, by identifying the constructed features as genuine archaeological features through analysis of the tool marks, the stone provenance, and the spatial organization, by connecting the findings to the indigenous traditions through collaborative research with the communities whose traditions point to these locations. None of this requires extraordinary methods. It requires ordinary archaeological methods applied in extraordinary locations, with extraordinary rigor and extraordinary respect for the traditional knowledge that has been pointing to those locations for longer than the formal discipline has existed. The investigation is possible. The evidence is there. The traditions are there. The caves are there. What remains is the will to ask the question seriously enough to fund the investigation that would answer it. Let's also talk about the human relationship to darkness, because this is something that any extended discussion of cave habitation needs to address honestly. Living underground is not the natural condition of our species. We are diurnal creatures, adapted to daylight, to the open air, to environments where we can see and be seen. The psychological challenge of sustained underground existence is significant. The absence of natural light, the disorientation of constant darkness, the acoustic strangeness of enclosed underground spaces, the physical constraints of navigating low passages and narrow chambers. All of these create psychological pressures that surface life does not produce. How did underground communities manage these pressures? The answer is probably the same way that human communities have always managed the psychological challenges of their environments, through culture, through story, ritual, music, ceremony, the deliberate organization of shared experience in ways that create meaning and community, and the sense that the challenges being faced are part of a larger story that gives them significance. The underground culture that a sustained cave-dwelling community would have developed is something we can only speculate about, but speculate intelligently. The fire management that was central to underground life would have been both practical and ceremonial. Fire in a deep cave does not just provide light and warmth. It provides a focus for community life, a center around which the social world organizes itself. The smoke from underground fires, which would have required careful management of airflow to prevent accumulation, would have created specific chemical environments in certain chambers, environments that might have been associated with specific states of consciousness and specific ritual functions. The sounds of underground water, the drip of cave formations, the flow of underground streams, the occasional distant rumble of geological settling, would have been the acoustic environment of underground life. These sounds, constant and distinctive, and unlike anything on the surface, would have been incorporated into the symbolic world of an underground community in ways we can only imagine. The drip of water becomes a measure of time. The sound of an underground stream becomes a guide to navigation. The geological sounds of the mountain itself become voices, presences, communications from the living rock. The formations of cave systems, the stalactites and stalagmites, the flowstone, the boxwork, the crystal gardens of deep cave chambers, would have been objects of sustained observation and wonder for underground communities. The formations grow over thousands of years in patterns that respond to the subtle movements of water and air. An underground community that lived in close association with cave formations over generations would have developed detailed knowledge of those patterns, knowledge that would have been inseparable from the spiritual significance assigned to the formations as expressions of the living underground world. All of this, the fire culture, the water culture, the rock culture, the sound culture of underground life, would have shaped the consciousness of cave-dwelling communities in ways that subsequently shaped the surface cultures that emerged from them. The kiva architecture of the ancestral Puebloans, with its subterranean form and its central fire and its smoke hole that echoes the cave entrance, may be a surface recreation of the underground experience, a deliberate effort to recreate the physical and psychological conditions of cave life in a surface structure that allowed the rituals and the consciousness of underground existence to continue after the community had returned to the prophet. Surface. The kiva is a cave you build. It is an underground space you construct on the surface, or just below it, to preserve the experience of the underground in a community that no longer lives there. It is a memorial to the underground, a physical reminder of where the people came from and what they experienced there, and what they learned about themselves and their world in the dark beneath the mountains. This interpretation of kiva architecture is not original to this account. It has been proposed by archaeologists who work on ancestral Puebloan sites and who have noted the consistent association between kiva form and the physical characteristics of natural cave spaces. The circularity, the low ceiling, the central fire pit, the sipapu hole in the floor, the ladder emerging through the ceiling as the only entry and exit, all of these features replicate the experience of being in a cave chamber in a way that is too consistent to be coincidental. The kiva is the surface memory of the underground origin. And the underground origin, encoded in the kiva's form and in the emergence narratives that give the kiva its sacred meaning, may be a real historical memory of the time when the ancestors of the Puebloan peoples lived in cave systems beneath the Rocky Mountains and the Colorado Plateau during the most extreme environmental period in the recent history of North America. That memory, if it is a memory and not merely a metaphor, is the key to the cave mystery. It is the connecting thread between the oral traditions that mark caves as sacred, the physical features of cave systems that suggest organized human activity older than the accepted timeline, and the geological and climatological evidence that makes underground refugia during the Younger Dryas not just possible but plausible. The cave mystery beneath the Rocky Mountains is, in the end, a memory mystery. The question is not just what happened underground. The question is what was remembered about it, and how accurately the memory was preserved, and how we can read it now. The oral traditions are memories. The kiva is a memory. The sacred geography of the mountain peoples is a memory. The emergence narratives of a dozen indigenous nations are memories. Collectively, they are pointing to the same events, the same places, the same underground history that the physical evidence is also pointing to, in its fragmentary, unexcavated, undated, officially unacknowledged way. To read those memories accurately requires both the rigor of the archaeologist and the respect of the ethnographer, and the patience of the geologist, and the humility of the historian, who knows that official narratives are always incomplete, and sometimes wrong in ways that matter enormously for how we understand who we are and where we came from. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network does not yield its secrets easily. It requires all of these approaches, working together, supported by the recognition that the question is important enough to justify the sustained effort required to approach an answer. That recognition is the beginning of the real investigation. The investigation that this continent's oldest history has been waiting for since the first modern archaeologist put a trowel in the ground in the American West and decided, based on the evidence available at the time, that the story began 13,000 years ago. The story began earlier. It began underground, in the caves beneath the mountains, in the dark, in the ancient rock, in the voices of the traditions that have never stopped saying so. The caves are patient. The mountains are patient. The traditions are patient. We are the only element in this equation with a reason to hurry. Because every year that passes without the serious investigation this evidence deserves is another year in which the evidence may be further compromised, further obscured, further lost to the natural processes of decay and water infiltration and geological change that are working against the archaeological record even as we speak. The window for investigation is not infinite. The caves are ancient, but they are not static. They are changing, slowly but continuously, in ways that work against the preservation of the oldest human traces. The investigation needs to happen. The questions need to be asked with the rigor and the resources they deserve. The traditions need to be listened to with the respect they have earned through thousands of years of faithful preservation. And the caves need to be entered, not just by solo explorers with field notebooks and amateur cameras, by teams of archaeologists, geologists, ethnographers, and indigenous knowledge holders working together in the shared recognition that the truth about this continent's oldest history is underground, and that finding it requires going down. Down into the dark, down into the rock, down into the caves that have been waiting for this investigation longer than any human institution has existed. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network is one of the most important unsolved problems in American prehistory. It is also one of the most solvable, given the right combination of will, resources, and intellectual courage. That combination is within reach. The question is whether we will reach for it. The caves are open. The evidence is there. The traditions are speaking. All that remains is the decision to listen deeply enough to hear what they are saying. And what they are saying in the end is simple. We were here. We went underground. We survived. We emerged. We remembered. The memory is still speaking, in the traditions of the people who carry it. In the marks on the cave walls, where the light from ancient fires played against the stone. In the constructed features deep in the rock where communities organize their underground lives, with the same care and intention that any community brings to the building of a home. The memory is still speaking. The question is whether we are ready to hear it. That readiness, if it is ever to come, begins here, with the recognition that the mystery is real, that the evidence is real, that the traditions are real, that the caves are real and accessible and full of the oldest human history on this continent. And that the investigation, when it finally comes, when someone finds the combination of courage and resources and institutional support and indigenous partnership that makes it possible, will not just change what we know about the past. It will change what we understand about ourselves, about what it means to be human on this particular piece of the earth, about the depth and the richness and the complexity of the story we are all part of. The Rocky Mountains have been watching that story for 60 million years. The caves have been holding it for tens of thousands. The traditions have been telling it for as long as anyone can remember. We are somewhere near the beginning of the part where we finally start to understand what we have been carrying all along. The dark is patient. The truth is patient. We are the ones who have to decide to go find it. And the caves are waiting. There is one last thing to consider before we close this account, and it is perhaps the most personal dimension of everything we have been discussing. The Rocky Mountain Cave mystery is not just an archaeological question. It is a question about inheritance, about what is owed to the past, about the responsibilities that come with living on land that holds a history deeper than any official record acknowledges. The indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountain region have been carrying this history, carrying it in their traditions, their sacred geographies, their oral accounts of what happened underground in the time before. They have been carrying it without adequate recognition, without the academic partnership that their knowledge deserves, without the formal acknowledgement that their traditions contain historical information of enormous importance to the broader human story. The investigation of the Rocky Mountain Cave Network is not just a scientific project, it is a reckoning. A reckoning with the history of how this continent's past has been studied, by whom, for whom, and with what assumptions about whose knowledge counts and whose traditions deserve to be taken seriously. The cave mystery cannot be solved without the indigenous traditions that have been pointing to the answer for centuries. And those traditions cannot be engaged honestly without confronting the history of how they have been treated by the institutions that should have been listening to them all along. This is uncomfortable territory for the academic archaeology of North America. It requires not just methodological revision, but ethical revision. Not just better tools, but different relationships. Not just more funding, but more humility. The caves will not give up their secrets to any expedition that treats the indigenous communities whose sacred geography maps those caves as obstacles to investigation rather than as partners in it. The caves will speak to communities that have been listening to them for generations, through researchers who have earned the trust that listening requires. The investigation that this evidence deserves is an investigation conducted in genuine partnership, guided by genuine respect, oriented toward a truth that includes the indigenous voice as a primary source rather than a secondary commentary on findings produced by other methods. That investigation is possible. The relationships that would support it are possible to build. The institutional frameworks that would enable it are possible to create. The funding that would sustain it is possible to secure in a world that increasingly recognizes the importance of interdisciplinary research and indigenous knowledge systems. What it requires is the decision that this matters enough to do properly. That the deep history of this continent matters enough to invest in the relationships and the methods and the time that doing it properly requires. The Rocky Mountain Cave Network will still be there when that decision is made. The caves are patient. The traditions are patient. The mountains are patient. The question is simply when we decide that the story they are holding is important enough to hear, and with that decision, the mystery begins to resolve. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic discovery, but gradually, through the accumulation of carefully gathered evidence, through the honest engagement with traditions that have been faithfully preserved, through the application of the best available methods to the most significant remaining questions in the deep history of this continent. The caves are waiting, the traditions are speaking, the evidence is there. The rest is up to us. The mountains have always known what was inside them. Every geologist who has mapped a passage, every explorer who has squeezed through a narrow throat into a chamber no modern person had entered before, every indigenous elder who has walked to a specific cave at a specific time of year and spoken the words that their own elders spoke in the same place, all of them have been touching the same deep reality. The Rocky Mountains are not just rock, they are record. The record of a human story older and more complex than we have acknowledged, written in the stone beneath our feet, waiting in the dark for the light that will finally read it clearly.